program again, not the same program, of course. We did discuss, I'm really hoarse. I was just cheering for my youngest of 4 at his basketball game. I can't believe I still have them at basketball games. So I'm really, if my voice gives out, you'll know. But people, there are basically 4 things you can talk about when you talk to Jewish audiences and keep hold of them. One of them is the Holocaust, of course. One of them is Israel. One of them is American Jewry. And the 4th, and often the largest, is Jesus, right? Nice Jewish boy. And we've been discussing him at length in a previous series. And now we're back with series 2. And this is part 1. I want to talk about the lay of the land. But I just thought I'd put up a screen to answer a question that you might be having, seeing that I teach at Vassar College, an American liberal arts institution in Poughkeepsie, New York. And I thought you might like to see, before you ask me, the reply of our fabulous president, Elizabeth Bradley, regarding what she would have said if she had been brought before Congress to testify. Death to anyone is considered disruptive, meaning minimally, right? And definitely against our community expectations. We do not accept anti-Semitism on this campus. Needless to say, we don't accept cries or writing or yelling of death to anyone at Vassar College. So I thought I'd let you know that I'm pleased and proud to work here, and very pleased and proud about our president, and feel that our students, many of whom are coming over for Hanukkah quite soon, which is why I have to stick to the time, are exemplary and really have been doing very well in spite of the difficult times. I want to talk about an older Jewish world of Jesus's time, and I want to go back over some points in this second series that people felt could have been dealt with in more depth in the first series that I didn't get to in the first series. And it's so nice to see a lot of you who I recognize from the first series, and I recognize from, as Sharon says, days of yore. I think it was a third 1-month scholar in Orange County. So that was a long time ago. And it was, I'm so glad to see so many of you still with us, and so many other institutions sending people to be with us. So there were some questions about, would I expand on this or that? And one of the questions was the question of geography. Geography is very much determinative in history, obviously, and in religious conceptualizations of religion. And I want to talk about the world of Jesus's time, and particularly about his Eretz Israel, his land of Israel, and where he's situated in it, and what it means to be where he was from in that place, and how that forms his character and the way he's depicted, at least in the Gospels, which is our major, as you know, source of information, right? We don't have outside corroborative evidence or support. So we depend on the Gospels, but the Gospels themselves can be correlated with slightly later rabbinic writings, and with contemporary historians of the period, though not of the person. So Flavius Josephus, a great historian of the period, who did not write about Jesus, in spite of the fact that in the Slavonic editions, the Slavonic Old Church, Slavonic Orthodox Eastern Church additions to Josephus, there is a passage about Jesus that's interpolated in there. It's not in any of the good manuscripts or the old manuscripts or the Greek manuscripts, but nonetheless, what Jesus says about the time and place are very important for our understanding of Jesus. Just a quick recap about where we are when the curtains part and we get to meet this fellow called Jesus. We have come with this people, who we now call the Jewish people, on a long odyssey. In the book of Genesis, we have Abraham, who's called the Ivri, the Hebrew. If you ever wondered what Hebrew means, it comes from the word la'avor, to cross over. So he crosses over the river in Mesopotamia, right? From Ur Kasdim to the land of promise. He crosses over from one culture to another culture, from the culture of polytheism, that is the belief in and worship of many gods, to what we call monolatry, that is the belief in many gods, but the knowledge or the conviction that one God, that is his God, the God that spoke to Abraham, kicks the asses of all those other gods, right? And is the only God whose worship is fitting. Jews eventually, when they become Jews, become monotheists. Excuse me, this is very hard for me tonight. I didn't realize that. Jews eventually become monotheists, which means that they believe in only one God, and all other gods are deemed to be idols. But in Abraham's time, and up through the time of the composition of most of the books of the Pentateuch, look at Exodus, right? The Song of the Sea. Who is like you, Adonai, among the gods, right? So there's a sense that there's a pantheon of gods, and Yud-He, Vav-He, right? Pronounced by us Adonai, is the chief god, et cetera, right? So he's the crossover artist from one culture to another. Then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob, as you saw in the Torah portion just of last week, gets renamed. And because of his experiences, he, in wrestling with God and with men, he is named the God wrestler, Yisrael. And so his children become the people or the children of Israel, who is Jacob, and what will become the Jewish people are called the Israelites throughout the book of Exodus and throughout most of the rest of the Tanakh. At the time of the Babylonian exile, Jews end up in the north, exiled to Babylonia, and return roughly a century. It said 70 years, maybe a little more, a little less, some of them to the land of Israel. Most of the exiled Israelites remain. They are the 10 so-called lost tribes. They make their way all over the world to pre-existing diasporas of Jews and to new diasporas. And the ones that come back are the Judahites and the very small tribe of Benjamin. And the Judahites, it's hard to say, Judahites, right? So they're just called the Jews, the Yehudim, those who returned from the Babylonian exile. And in the very last books of the Tanakh and in all of the New Testament, these people are called Judaios, Jews. That's where we get the term Jews. Now, I have pointed out in the other series, and we'll point out again, that while the Hebrew Bible is about Hebrews and Israelites, and eventually in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, and Esther about Jews, the New Testament, the Gospels and the letters, but the Gospels primarily use the term Jews exclusively, and the Gospels are a Jewish story. They occur in a Jewish land, an occupied Jewish land. They occur to Jewish people, and most of the actors in the story are themselves Jews. So what is this land? Well, this land is Eretz Israel. It's the land of promise. It's the land that was called by its Roman occupiers Syria Palestina, right? Which means, if we expand the term, the unnamed, and unnamed is important, land between non-Jewish Syria in the north, right? And the non-Jewish Phoenician and Philistine lands to the west, right? Now, why was it called by that name? Because the first thing you do when you occupy a land is you try to strip people of their identity and culture and of their history. And so the Romans wished to do this to the Jews, and they did not want the words Judea, the land of the Jews, or Eretz Israel, right, the land of the people of Israel, as it was called by indigenous Jews, to appear on anyone's lips. So that those words, Syria, Palestina, or Palestine, were a deliberate erasure of Jewish presence, which, as you can obviously understand why the name Palestine continues to irk Jews to this day, although many Jews in the early days of the mandate and of the state, call themselves Palestinians, right? Because that was the term that history used for this area until Jews returned. But it was originally a term of opprobrium or negativity. Now, if we look at the lay of the land, so to speak, we can see that it is divided into 5 distinct territories, not including Egypt in the south and what was called Syria in the north, right? At the time of Jesus, you had Judea and Samaria, today's West Bank, which encompassed, of course, the important centers of Jerusalem, which you see here in the cutout, but also Jericho and Qumran and the desert territories, which were the homeland of a particular group of Jews who were desert dwellers and, and somewhat odd and rather fanatic in their beliefs and practices, right? The Dead Sea sect and the Qumran group. We know very, very little about the distinctions between these groups, but they lived in this area. Jerusalem, of course, was the center of the Jewish scholarly world. It was the center of the cultic practice. When you say cult in religion, you mean a religious sacrificial practice with rituals. It doesn't mean, something that's para-religious or doesn't have a negative sense, right? So when we say the cultic center, it's the place where the temple was and where the authority, the royal authority of the Jews was situated until the Romans cut off the Israelite monarchy. You can see the geographic kind of layout here. And what's actually most important for us is going to be this small area here in the north called the Galilee or the Galilee. And it is centered around the Sea of Galilee or Lake Kinneret or Lake Gennesaret, depending on who's doing the talking. Whereas the Jordan River connects to the Dead Sea at the bottom, which is proximate to Jerusalem. And you have the coastal areas here in which Jews and Romans did business abroad, right? Where ships came and went and were centers of commerce and of trade. But we will be concentrating on a north-south dichotomy, on a dichotomy between Galilee and Judea. And I'm not an historian, so I'm not going to tell you the entire story of the Herodian royal family and who the tetrarchs were after the death of Herod and all of that history. As they say in the book of Esther, if you want to hear more about Mordecai and his deeds and the politics that were going on in Persia, they, of course, are written about in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of the Persians and the Medians, right? So there is much good history written. I want to do a religious conceptual analysis of North and South. So if you think about it, in our own country, North and South are very different culturally, politically, religiously. Yes, there are pockets of sanity, depending on what your definition of sanity is. I'm being very careful. In each of those places, North and South, but they have distinctive character, and their character is different one from the other. So too, in Jesus's time, was Eretz Israel and its geography, but in a way, the geography was reversed. If we think of the North, including the West and East coasts, as the sort of sophisticated hub of government and where intellectual stuff is going on, right? And we think, and I'm not saying this is true, this is just a general, I think, Northern kind of prejudice, but not too prejudice, right? View of the way the state life of the states have developed. The South is more rural. The South is more religious. The South is more folksy, right? The South doesn't want to hear about pointy-headed intellectuals at Vassar College, right? And that same division, as we will see, appended in Eretz Israel of the first century, except it was reversed. The South, Judea, was the hub of intellectualism and the cultic center. And the north was one of the regions of the land of Israel where weird and wild stuff was going on. I mentioned before that even in the south, there were pockets of weird and wild with the Qumran sect and the Dead Sea sect, maybe the same group, maybe different groups, the Therapeutae, the Essenes. These groups, whether singular groups or individual kind of monastic communities, placed a high priority on ritual purity. We don't know much about the role of women in these societies. They might have been all male societies. They had wild ideas about eschatology, the end of time, and the battles between good and evil that would ensue. So even in the intellectual South, there was a lot of emotionality, right? Particularly as you got closer to the Dead Sea and to the Jordan. And in the North, it was the Wild West. Sorry, it's very confusing. The North had a lot of wildness and interest, as we will see as we go along. Let me sort of give you a lay of the political and religious land before we get to talk about geography and its influence. So the Romans ruled from 63 before the Common Era to after 70 of the Common Era. And they did two things very well. They brought peace and stability, that is, with reference to the peoples around this Jewish polity, right? Which was no longer a Jewish commonwealth because it was under occupation, but it was a Jewish polity. It was an entity that was religiously Jewish, and they brought heavy taxation, right? But the Romans did that everywhere. That was their policy in exchange for heavy taxes and very much by the book's law enforcement. You would receive municipal services, good roads, protection, et cetera, et cetera. The Romans enforced the laws pretty heavily, particularly on people that they considered to be rebellious. And so punishments, the worst of which was crucifixion, which occurred not to one Jew, but to tens of thousands of Jews in this period, were the norm for anything from stealing an apple, right, to declaring yourself the ruler of the of the Jewish nation to the exclusion of Caesar, right? So anything along that spectrum could merit your death by the particularly horrifying and agonizing torture of crucifixion. The Jewish residents had a history of foreign rule, so they knew how to live among and within and under foreign domination. Their culture was more or less Hellenized. That is, the majority of people, at least in the South, spoke Greek regularly as their normal language. They also communicated in Aramaic, a language we'll have occasion to talk about as we go on. And they also used Hebrew for ritual purposes. Now, in this group of Jewish residents, there were a number of subgroups. And before we get to Jesus's followers on the left, I'm going over to the right. The primary sort of dominant group before the first century were the temple priests in terms of not their numbers, but their influence, right? They ran the religion and thus they ran the nation. It was their close reading of scripture in its literal sense that was important. They were called the Sadducees after Tzadok, who was a very important priest, priestly lineage. They were resident mostly in Jerusalem. They served in the temple in shifts over the course of the year. They came from the tribe of Levi. They were Levites. And the most prominent families among them, descended directly from Aaron the priest, were the priests in the temple. And the religion was mainly, as you know, sacrificial. That is, if you did something wrong, or you wanted to celebrate a life event, or you were just happy to be alive and grateful, you would bring an animal sacrifice. And bringing an animal sacrifice involved a number of stages, including confessing your sin literally into the fur of that animal, lying on top of the animal, called smicha, and confessing your sin. Having first made your sin right with whoever you had sinned against, you are now going to expiate that sin before God. And then the animal would be slaughtered in a special way and burnt in a special way, and cooked in a special way. Part of the food would go, the animal would go to the priests as payment for this religious service, and part of it would be burnt for God, so to speak. And you would watch this occur, and you would experience the catharsis of saying, whoa, there but for grace of God, literally, go I. So that the priesthood was very, very important, and really was the glue that tied the Israelites together. Now, I say the Israelites, the Jews, but I actually mean mostly people in the South, because people in the North, as we'll see, didn't often get down to the temple in Jerusalem, or as often as they should have. They were required to do so 3 times a year for the 3 major pilgrimage holidays. They were, we know from the sources, often highly and massively delinquent in not going to the temple. They regarded the temple in the way that people in the rural South, regard colleges and universities in the North, right, with kind of suspicion, right, and distaste, and the feeling of what do they know down there that has to do with my relationship with God? Am I really going to go and sacrifice an animal and then be expiated? Can I speak directly to God? Aren't there other ways of mediation? That was the feeling among many people in the North. So this was not only a feeling among many people in the North, but in the South too, people began to become increasingly frustrated with the temple priests because they were often in collaboration or collusion with the Herodians, who were in political power, right? And so a group called the Prushim, those who separate themselves, or perhaps it comes from Parshanut, those who read scripture, emerged, and we talked about them a lot last time, and we will in the next session. Suffice it to say, these are the ancestors, ideologically, of the rabbis. And their belief was that you didn't have to be descended from Aaron to be able to serve God. One served God through the study, the learning, the constant attention to scripture and the development of law. And one caused one's home to be a temple and one's table to be an altar. And they found many followers among the people, particularly people in the North, but also the South as well. And they were a sort of opposition group to the Sadducees. And it is good that they were, because eventually the temple was destroyed and the Sadducees were out of a job. And it was the Prushim who carried on the center of Judaism by being a religious, cultural, literary meritocracy rather than a hereditary aristocracy. There were the desert ascetics, who I talked about, and there were zealots. These are people, could be from any group, who basically just wanted to be terrorists and believed that the Roman regime should be brought down through violence, and they stabbed people in the street. And then there were various other groups, including Samaritans, a fascinating sort of para-Jewish group, and people who weren't Jewish at all, who lived in the land of Israel. Jesus's followers consisted of a number of God-fearing Gentiles who it says from, I don't know why I put that way in the side, who became Jews, and Jews who were mostly Prushim, who followed Jesus and kept the commandments of the Torah as Jesus himself did. So Jesus drew from some Gentiles, seems very few in his lifetime, perhaps some Samaritans, and mostly from the Prushim. So as you can imagine, Jesus's sort of approach was anti-priestly, but it was pro-Torah. It was very interested in interpreting Torah and of the meritocracy of learning Torah and of creating a particular shita. Shita means a way in Torah study, a methodology of Torah study that has been distorted over the centuries, but was basically trying to push, as many of his colleagues slightly later, Rabbi Akiva and others, pushed the emphasis of law in the direction of love. And we'll talk a little more about that, and we have done so in the past. But it's very important that Jesus comes from Galilee. He was probably born in Nazareth, although the Gospels have him born in Bethlehem because they want to project him as the messianic inheritor of King David, right? So, all the Israelite kings were anointed with oil. They were called Mashiach. And the Mashiach, or the Messiah, as we've said many times, is not a supernatural figure, it's a political figure. The Romans took away the Davidic line, the line of kingship, and so people hoped for its restoration. And so those who hoped for its restoration wanted to show that Jesus was an inheritor of the mantle of King David, therefore born in Bethlehem to a Davidic family. But as far as most scholars can determine, this is not the case. He was born in the Lower Galilee in Nazareth, and he preached in many of the areas and healed around the Sea of Galilee, where he became a healer and a teacher and a somewhat radical preacher. I want to talk a little bit about Jesus the Galilean, because it is the geographical character of the Galilee, which is separate and distinct from that of Judea lower down, that is very important to understanding Jesus. In fact, some scholars, Elaine Pagels has written about this, as has Amy Jill Levine, understand Judaios in the Gospels, the Jews, as sometimes meaning the Jews as a whole, but often meaning the Judeans. So there's a critique of the South, the pointy-headed intellectual South, by the people in the North. And when I say that Jesus found followers among Pharisees, it may surprise you, because the Gospels make the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the scribes and the Pharisees, in various configurations, to be the enemies of Jesus. But in fact, it was from the people who were anti-temple or temple hierarchy, right? And pro-learning and study and knowledge and interpretation that Jesus drew his followers. Although many of his followers, and this is what I want to discuss particularly today, being from Galilee, were also relatively uninterested in biblical interpretation, unless it was non-literal, right? Highly metaphorical. It massaged and how can you say it, supported their feelings of the value of their lives as shepherds and farmers. I don't know much about, history, I don't know much about religion. I know that I have my sheep and my flock and my vineyard, and when I want to talk to God, I talk to God, right? There was a kind of appeal in Jesus's teachings. So you should know that the Galileans were Aramaic speaking. Here is the Aramaic language. You can see that the same letters, Hebrew letters as we call them, in various configurations at various times of history, are used to represent the sounds in Aramaic. But Aramaic was the language that everybody spoke in the ancient world. You could be Phoenician and write it in Phoenician letters. You could be Babylonian or Assyrian and write it in Babylonic cuneiform. And Aramaic is somewhat like Hebrew. It looks like Hebrew. And there are some word cognates, but they can be very, very different. So if we say in Hebrew in Genesis, right, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, right? In Aramaic, it's milkademin bechachma baraya shichlal yat shamya v'yat ara, right? So you see Shemiyah for Shemayim and Ara for Aretz and yat for et, right? Or here, that was neophiti, here's unkelos. These are two different Aramaic translations. Bekadmin vara ya, yat shemaya vayat ara, right? So there are similarities. But there are significant differences. And yet, when Jesus gives us his famous Lord's Prayer, as we began our last series with, you can see very clearly that Jesus's Aramaic, back translated from the Greek, has distinct similarities with Jewish prayer and Jewish sources, particularly the Kaddish. But here's the thing. People in the South did not like people in the North. They didn't like what they knew and what they didn't know. They didn't like their character. They didn't like what they regarded as their uncouthness, and they didn't like their language. Remember, everybody's speaking Aramaic of one kind or another. But look at this wonderful passage from the Babylonian Talmud, a little bit after Jesus, Ruven 53b, which reflects back on the linguistic distinctions. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, with regard to the people of Judea, who were particular in their speech and always made certain that it was both precise and refined, right? So where is the Talmud's allegiance? Talmud is written in Babylonia, but it's also written in Jerusalem. And the allegiance is with the South, right? Their Torah knowledge endured for them. But with regard to the people from the Galilee, who were not particular in their speech, their Torah knowledge did not endure for them. The Gemara asks, is this a matter at all dependent on being particular with one's language? Rather, with regard to the people of Judea, who were precise in their language and who would formulate mnemonics for their studies so they could remember them, their Torah knowledge endured for them. With regard to the people of the Galilee, they didn't do that. No, actually, the Gemara responds, they had different approaches to learning, but the most important thing, the Gemara says, is that imprecision in speech means that Galileans talk with a heavy accent, a heavy northern accent, right? As it was taught in a Baraita, there was a certain person from the Galilee who would walk and say to people, who has Amar? Who has Amar? They said to him, foolish Galilean, what do you mean? Galileans didn't pronounce the guttural letters properly, so it was unclear whether he sought a hamar, a donkey, to ride, or wine, hamar, to drink, or wool, hamar, to wear, or a lamb, imar, to slaughter. This is an example of a lack of precision, says the Gemara in the Galilean speech. Isn't that great? It gets even better. The Gemara cites another lack of linguistic precision of the Galileans. There was a certain woman who wanted to say to her friend, right, my neighbor, come and I will feed you milk. However, because she didn't pronounce it correctly, she said, my neighbor, lavia, right? Come and may a lioness eat you. So the Gemara cites another example of ignorance and incivility of the Galileans. There was a certain woman who came before a judge intending to say, Master, Sir, Marikari, spelled with a kuf. I had a board and they stole it from me. Tavla avet li ugnehuva mimeni. But instead she said, Master, servant, Mari Kri, spelled with a kaf. I had a beam and they stole it from me. Tafla havet li ugneva min. And it was so large they would hang you upon it, and your feet would not reach the ground. Says the Gemara about this, right? So the Galileans are linguistically imprecise, but they're also foolish. Now, everybody, I hope, knows about Bria. If you don't know about Bria, you can study with Gila Fine. She's much better at Bria than I am. But Bria was the wife of Rabbi Meir, and she was a very wise woman. When Rabbi Meir prayed for the death and destruction of his enemies, of evil people, she said, no, rather you should pray for the obviation of evil in the world. That way we wouldn't have to worry about evil people. and we wouldn't have to be so petty as to pray for the deaths of particular people. She was a very smart person, but she hated Galileans. And Rabbi Yossi, poor Rabbi Yossi, appears in the Haggadah. We love him, right? He's walking along the way, and he meets Bria, and he says to her, "Pray tell me, on which path shall we walk in order to get to Lod?" And she says to him, "Galilee, shotes, stupid, foolish Galilean. Didn't the sages say, Al tarbeh sicha im ha'isha, don't multiply conversation with a woman? You should have said your question much more succinctly. Which way to Lod?" So look how smart she is. She is making fun of the rabbis, of which he is one, right? But she's also making fun of the fact that he's a northerner, and northerners don't know the halakha, even if she regards the halakha as kind of a not such a great halakha because it's misogynist, right? So she's holding him to it, but she knows that he's a moron, right? Or so she thinks. Galileans can be viewed as arrogant, right? So it says in the Gemara in Shabbat, 80b, what is meant by the word andifi? So a certain Galilean happened to come to Babylonia, and they said, stand and teach us this very esoteric part of Ezekiel, the Ma'aseh HaMerkavah. So he said to them, I will teach it to you as Rabbi Nehemiah taught it to his colleague. Right now, this is a part of Jewish learning about the divine presence on the divine throne or the divine chariot that you're not supposed to teach in public. So a hornet emerged from the wall and stung him on the forehead, on diffi, and he died. Apparently, says the Gemara, on diffi means forehead. And with regard to this incident itself, they said about him in a play of words, from his own that came to him, min dele dale, and he was punished for his arrogance. So this arrogant Galilean. The other thing is that Galileans seem to love parables. And here we have some examples. So the Gemara asks, what's mashkuchit? Here in Babylonia, it says, they translate it as a bell, karkashta. It sounds like a bell, right? Karkashta, right? Mashkuchit, that a shepherd rings and whose sound the flock follows. Rabbi Yaakov in Babylonia said, it's referring to a goat that goes in front of the flock that they follow. So the goat is called the mashkuchit, the one with the bell on it, the bell wether. Maybe you've heard that expression, the bellwether. The Gemara notes, this explanation is similar to a certain Galilean who taught concerning this goat. When a shepherd is angry with his flock, he blinds the mashkuchit, right? Similarly, when God is angry with the Jewish people, he appoints unsuitable leaders for them. Oh, is that true? Is that true? Well, Galilean, right? He likes this sort of story, this sort of parable, right? Another Galilean taught in front of Rav Chisda says God gave a threefold Torah, prophets in writing, to a threefold nation, priests, Levites, and Israelites, by means of a third born, Moses, who's the third after Aaron and Miriam, on the third day of the separation of men and women on Mount Sinai, in the third month of Sivan. Okay, so that's a homily, right? A lot of threes. And the rabbis love threes because three is beginning, middle, end, right? Shouldn't be strange at all to us that Christians are interested in the idea of the Trinity, the number three, past, present, future, right? Pronouns, all of that. It's very much part of our mutual heritage. But this is interesting. It says, on whose opinion is this homily based? On the opinion of the rabbis who hold that the Torah was given on the third day of separation of men and women in the Sinai text, not on the fourth day as others held. And who are the others? The Sadducees, right? Because a close literal reading seems to indicate the fourth day for some, right? So not only is this Galilean pro-parabolic, is into parables, right? But is anti-Sadducee, right? I love this one. This one is about halakha. A certain Galilean taught before Rav Chisda, the Holy Blessed One said to women, I placed a quarter, a revi'it of a log of blood, around 4 ounces, in you when you were formed so you can lose it monthly without harm. And about the matters of blood of menstruation, I warned you. So the Galilean is interested in explaining in a parabolic way, right, why women menstruate and how they don't die as a result of menstruation, right? There's a story in the previous section before BT Sanhedrin 113a, in which Elijah the prophet first prevents rain from falling during a torrential flood, and then no longer has possession of, quote, the key to make it fall again. So it's a Galilean who brings up this action as a parable. He says, to what is this comparable? It's comparable to a person who slammed the door and locked it and lost their key, right? And then Rabbi Yossi of Tzipori, who's also a Galilean, right, said, no, don't say Elijah the prophet, say Father Elijah, Papa Elijah, right? It's a deferential and affectionate characterization for the prophet. So you see the love of parables and you see this sense of folksiness. So what do we have so far? We have that Galileans are linguistically uncouth. We don't trust them to lead prayers. They are foolish sometimes. They are arrogant sometimes, but they're also interested in a particular kind of learning, which is parables. And finally, they are miracle workers, right? So the very famous story, several stories told about Choni Hamagel. I won't read the whole text, but simply to say that in times of drought, he was renowned for going out and drawing a circle around himself and saying, God, I will not leave this circle until you send rain. And sometimes God sent too much rain, right? But he had that personal relationship, shamanistic relationship, shall we say, with God. And there are a number of people in the Gemara who are folk healers. And then there are rabbinic healers. So particularly Hanina ben Dosa. And stories are told by him, about him, being able to heal and even raise the dead from a distance, right? So he says he's asked to heal Rabban Gamliel's son. He says, you may go and return to Rabban Gamliel, as the fever has left his son and he's already been healed. How do you know? Are you a prophet? He says, no, but I've been davening, and I know if my prayer is smooth in my mouth that God has heard my prayer. And lo and behold, God ends up having heard his prayer. There's other occasions in which he prays deeply. He places his head between his knees in order to meditate and pray for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's son, who falls ill, and his prayer is heard. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to himself, had I put my head between my knees and prayed, right, God would have paid me no attention. His wife said, and is Hanina better than you? He said, no, but his prayer is better received than mine because he's like a servant before the king, right? So he goes in and out even when the king is indisposed and makes requests. But I'm like a minister. I'm more important, but I can only enter when I'm invited. So you have a contrast between simple miracle workers and miracle workers who are rabbis. They're not as simple as Choni Hamagel, but they're miracle working rabbis. They're different than the standard order of rabbis who are more like ministers and less like servants. Now, when we think about Jesus, we think about him in these terms. You understand? The terms in which we think about Jesus, as we will continue to discuss next time, are Galilean terms. He's a folk healer. When he, remember from the last series, here's spit in your eye, right? How does he heal people? Puh, spits on his hand and rubs it on the eyes of the blind and they're healed. Or he heals at a distance, or he raises people who are apparently dead by lying on top of them, right? Like Elisha and Elijah raised people who are apparently dead, right? He's a folk healer. He's also mistrusted because he's from Galilee. You know, Bria might have said of Rabbi Yossi foolish Galilean, but of of Jesus, they said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Right. So what we'll have to consider as we go along, and our next session will be about what Jesus was in terms of how he fits in his methodology, learning, and approach. Because if he's a rabbi, he's a peculiar kind of rabbi. And if he's a rabbi, he's not a rabbi like we're used to having rabbis in our congregation. So what is a rabbi? What was a rabbi? Was Jesus a rabbi? It's very popular to speak of Jesus as a rabbi, but it's, as they say on Facebook in relationship status, it's complicated. And his Galileanness fits very directly into that. And we'll have more occasion to discuss it next time. But I'd like to address some questions if you like. And you can always write me at maepstein@vassar.edu. Sharon, I'll open it to you to ask a few questions. And we have about 8 minutes before I have to go and meet with these students.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. It was a great lecture, and I'm sure everybody agrees with that. One question that came up is you mentioned a lot about how Jesus was viewed external to the texts within the New Testament, and we can extrapolate a lot from the Talmud. I get that, but what other sources do you have that you're relying on for a greater understanding of him and his surroundings?
Excellent question. I teach a class called something like 100 Gospels and the Confused, Conflicted Life of Jesus. Sometimes it's called Jesus, A Radical Life. And as I said at the beginning, there is not a shred of evidence for a historical Jesus. There's also not a shred of evidence for historical Abraham or historical Moses, okay? For Muhammad, there's some evidence, right?
Or historical David or historical Solomon.
Correct. So, once you get, to the 7th century, you already have corroboration from outside sources. So all we have really is the Gospels. The Gemara, refers to this guy named Yeshu Pandera occasionally, who's this negative stuff about him as a magician, etc. It may be referring to Jesus, but it's unhelpful in terms of saying what was his shita b'limud, what was his way of learning. We can't learn from the fact that the Gemara says there was this guy who's burning in excrement in hell because he cut his flesh and put the divine name in it so he could work miracles, right? Those are interesting things. We could discuss them at another juncture, but we have very little sort of corroborative evidence outside the Gospels, and you are absolutely correct that the Gemara is not it's not a raya. It's not, as we say in yeshiva, it's not a raya. It's not proof of anything. It's a couple hundred years later. But the dudes who are speaking in the Gemara are the Einiklach, the grandchildren of the people who were around in Jesus's time, and what was developing in Jesus's time develops in the Gemara. So you can retrofit to a certain extent, or retro understand a lot from the Gemara about Prushim, Pharisees, and Sadducees and other groups. Thanks. Go ahead.
So we have a question here. I just want to read it. Do many or any doubt that there was a historical Jesus? I'm not going to answer your questions. I'm just reading you what the people are saying, because
I don't know. I mean, I suppose people do. Nobody. Let's put it this way: nobody's sane or scholarly, right? There's, my cousin, Shlomo Zalman probably does,
he changed the question as you were saying it. Do many or any scholars with capital S?
No, I don't think anybody who studied, the Gospels and the New Testament and has a PhD in this doesn't doubt that there was somebody, who was Jesus. The question, however, is what can we know about him, if anything, right? Is what we're trying to kind of tease out. Yeah.
Right. But of course, what's wonderful in that is that does any scholar believe that there was a historical Moses as opposed to anybody who believes that there wasn't a historical Jesus? So that's a wonderful balance. And I think that's a great sort of point to all of that, which is wonderful. Another question that one might ask, of course, is if Jesus were here, in your description of the North and the South, where would he be and how would he be different or differently perceived in both the North and the South of this country, right, as you introduced it?
Oh, in the North and the South of this country?
As you introduced it, right.
Okay. I'm often asked, what would Jesus do? I usually say, well, he'd be davening Mariv around now, right?
Exactly.
Exactly, right? So in the North and the South of this country, as I very broadly and probably stupidly conceptualized it, I think that Jesus's spiritual roots would have been with the Pentecostals and snake handlers, and Jesus's kind of intellectual chops, would have been somewhat influenced by the love of intellectualism and scholarship in the North. But the way he taught was basically to tell stories, as we'll see, and to open up halacha so that it could compromise the largest number of people, right? Which is what we always try to do in halacha, but in a really radical way. I would see Jesus as a son of the South, even to the extent of some of his attitudes toward women and some of his, maybe as a I'm not presuming anything of anyone, but as a liberal northern kind of leftist, right? I used to say progressive, but I don't.
No, we don't say that anymore. Right?
Well, maybe we should reclaim it. As a liberal leftist, it makes me sad. Like I like Jesus a lot. He's one of my favorite characters in history, but I don't see him like I can't make him over into my image. He's not thinking about text in the way that I think about text. He's thinking about text. He's saying, how can I basically stay in this system by a hair, right, whilst opening it up almost radically, in ways that when we look at
thinking about inclusion,
in
the way that I think about inclusion, rather than about texts in the way that we would enjoy sitting and having a drink.
I don't know. I think some of the things that I would bring up because I think they're interesting. He would say, well, does it matter? I mean, how many people did it help today?
Right.
He was an activist in that sense, right? And I am in a liberal arts college surrounded by activists trying to make a case for scholarship very often, right? So I think that Jesus would be running around on picket lines and protests and much less in the library, Okay, listen, guys, I would like to stay here all evening. These were excellent questions, but I did promise people that I would get to making the latkes and lighting the candles, which we have not yet done, which is very, very bad. I wish you all a freiliche and a lichtige Hanukkah, a joyous and a light-filled Hanukkah. And remember, when Goethe, the great Enlightenment poet and scholar, was on his deathbed, he is rumored to have said these last words: more light. We can always use more light. On the other hand, maybe he was just saying we should open the blinds, because it's dark in here. I don't know. But I wish you, Sharon, and yours, and all of you lovely people who I'm not kissing, but who I do love, all the best, always. And we'll see you next week. Take care.
Good night, everybody. Have a great night, everybody. Bye-bye.